Okay, so before attempting to ascertain what a Biden foreign policy might look like, for Australia, I think it's probably pertinent to begin by reflecting a little bit on the core characteristics of the Trump administration's foreign policy, and then we can deduce whether there's going to be significant changes or not. So Trump's foreign policy with respect to the Pacific and America's rivalry with China specifically, which of course is the overriding regional consideration or dynamic, I'm going to argue was more or less an evolution of the Obama administration's foreign policy. The Trump administration did not mark a significant departure or revolution from the prior Obama administration, but rather reflected an escalation of a trajectory the United States had been placed on by Obama's 8 years in office. And that's notwithstanding the fact that Trump's foreign policy in the Pacific differed quite dramatically to Obama's in rhetoric and in tactics and in intensity, but nevertheless, not substantively. Trump was, as we're all quite familiar with, I'm sure, quite haphazard and much more haphazard than Obama. The Obama administration, he flip-flopped a lot. Initially, if you recall earlier in his administration, praising Xi Jinping's authoritarianism, wanting to cut a grand economic deal with China, and moved away from that to initiating quite a significant trade war, escalated military tensions in the South China Sea, increased freedom of navigation operations, controversial arms sales to Taiwan, explicitly naming China America's #1 strategic rival, directing the military to restructure to defeat China in a war, and presided over an unprecedented military buildup to achieve that aim. And of course, there was his inflammatory rhetoric after the onset of the coronavirus, or the China virus, as you like to call it. Trump was also, of course, more unilateralist than Obama, had no qualms about aggressively pursuing US interests with no regard, and often a good deal of contempt for America's traditional allies and partners. Nevertheless, I think it's worth remembering that it was the Obama administration that initiated the pivot to Asia, which was perceived as a containment policy by China for fairly good reasons, I think. Beginning the process, it was that pivot that began the process of reorienting America's strategic and economic focus away from the Middle East and Bush's war on terror and towards Asia. And it was the pivot to Asia, Obama's pivot to Asia, along with some internal factors within China, which I'm not going to go into, but the major external factor that led to significant increases in tensions in the South China Sea began with Obama's pivot to Asia. It was in fact under the Obama administration that the US conducted its first freedom of navigation operation within 12 nautical miles of Chinese-built islands in 2015. It was the policy of the Obama administration to unsuccessfully alienate China from the region economically, such as by attempting to ram through the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that attempted to exclude China from the region, or by pressuring allies like Australia to refrain from joining Chinese regional economic institutions like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So what I'm trying to get at here is that while the Trump administration did significantly escalate the strategic and economic rivalry with China, Trump didn't initiate it. Credit for that goes to the Obama administration. And the reason that this is important, I think, and relevant to remember for our purposes today is because the new Biden administration is in fact populated with many of the same officials, including Biden himself, of course, who served during the Obama administration. And in fact, many key officials who were architects of the pivot to Asia are now part of the new Biden administration and have in fact expressed support for key elements of Trump's increasing assertiveness towards Beijing, even if they disagree with the tactics that he adopted. And so I think we should expect to see a fair degree of continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration when it comes to strategic and economic rivalry with China, because of the fact that rivalry began with Obama, and unfortunately the trend has been, I think will continue to be, in the direction of escalating tensions, divisions, and dangers in the US-China relationship. And While I think it's not all gloom and doom, there are opportunities, of course, for civil society in the United States predominantly to push the Biden administration in a more progressive direction. I think particularly on the domestic front. When it comes to foreign policy, though, I think there are real dangers that might, in fact, make the Biden administration even more dangerous than the Trump administration with respect to the potential for triggering a conflict with China. So, for example, if we take what are the Biden administration's key criticisms of the Trump administration with respect to foreign policy and specifically China, we can see they kind of boil down to three main criticisms, and they're very informative, I think. The first, the Biden administration has criticized the Trump administration and how that administration damaged America's relationships with its traditional allies. The second was or is the criticism of Trump's failure to win any substantive economic concessions from China, despite launching a very damaging trade war. It wasn't the economic competition with China that Biden administration is criticizing. It's the fact that America didn't seem to win anything out of that trade war. In fact, American consumers were damaged as a result of that trade war. And it didn't really improve America's overall economic deficit. Trade deficit, I should say. And the third criticism is the US supposedly turning away from its traditional values of democracy and human rights under the Trump administration, which of course have always been selectively applied. But I think if we look at those criticisms, what we can deduce from them is, if we look at the criticism of the Trump administration by the Biden administration, what we can deduce is that this kind of further points to what I was saying earlier, which is that the Biden administration, when it comes to China, is largely concerned with tactics. It's not concerned with substance or even policy objectives with respect to strategic and economic rivalry between the US and China. With the Biden administration likely going to adopt a softer and more or less polarizing rhetoric, certainly with its commitment to multilateralism and less polarizing policies domestically, the real danger, I think, is that the Biden administration will be more successful than the Trump administration in mobilizing America domestically and in convincing its allies, like Australia, to join with the US as it continues the Obama-Trump policy to confront and contain China. So I think it's worth taking a look at Biden himself and some of Biden's key appointments to get an idea of what we might expect from a Biden foreign policy with respect to Asia and China in particular, and the implications of that for Australia. If we take a look at Biden himself and those key appointments, I think that those dangers actually become more apparent. And any hope that a Biden administration might strike a kind of less militaristic approach towards China is probably short-sighted. So Biden himself, unfortunately, he has a long career, so we know what his positions are on most things. He's often sided with the more militaristic elements of the Democratic Party in the past. He supported the 2003 invasion of Iraq, for example. He's been a long-standing defender of the right-wing Netanyahu government in Israel. He's been an advocate for high military spending, supporter of US allied dictatorships in the Middle East and elsewhere. Although, I must say encouragingly, just yesterday, Biden declared America's end for its military support of Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, which was going nowhere for the Saudis anyway, and comes after nearly 6 years of utter devastation for the people of Yemen, of course. And I don't doubt for a moment that the Biden administration will not continue to prop up the highly repressive Saudi regime as one of its key client states in the Middle East. In fact, Biden said, as part of that announcement yesterday, that the US would remain committed to defending Saudi sovereignty. So I don't think we can expect too much of Biden himself. Unfortunately, in terms of his appointments, his key appointments, he's actually appointed a number of hardliners who are in fact to the right of himself in key foreign policy positions, the most significant being Anthony Blinken as Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor, which I'll come to in a moment. Senate Democrats, unfortunately, have also chosen one of their most hawkish members to serve as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Robert Menendez. Menendez, in fact, was a critic of both the George W. Bush and Trump administrations from the right on issues such as support for Israel, US interventions in Syria and Afghanistan. He frequently joined Republicans in criticizing President Obama when he previously served as chair for 2 years of the Senate committee. He was one of only two senior Democrats who opposed the Iran nuclear deal. So not a positive indication of where Biden might be intending to take US foreign policy. Anthony Blinken, as I mentioned, is the new Secretary of State. He was Deputy National Secretary Advisor and Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration. According to US officials and friends, close friends of Blinken, he's considered to be a centrist and a realist like Biden, but with a stronger interventionist streak, which unfortunately and unfavorably, I must say, contrasts with the Trump administration's tendency to be kind of non-interventionist, at least in terms of starting new wars. During the Obama administration, Blinken, in fact, broke with Biden to support military action in Libya. He later advocated for military action in Syria. And so like Menendez, Blinken is to the right of Biden when it comes to favoring military intervention. Again, none of this is a good omen. As I mentioned earlier, the Biden administration, in contrast to the Trump administration, is certainly more disposed towards utilizing its traditional alliance network and partners to achieve its foreign policy goals. And certainly nowhere is this likely to be more apparent than with respect to China. According to the New York Times, one of Blinken's primary objectives will be to, quote, try to coalesce skeptical international partners into a new competition with China. The favorite for defense secretary in the Biden administration was initially someone called Michelle Flournoy, who in fact established a strategic consultancy firm with Blinken in 2018. Flournoy was a very worrying choice, given she effectively advocated for an arms race with China and called for, and I'll quote her, enhancing US military capabilities so that the United States can credibly threaten to sink all of China's military vessels, submarines, and merchant ships in the South China Sea within 72 hours. It was an article that she penned for Foreign Affairs. The fact that she was widely considered to be Biden's favorite pick for the job remains concerning, even though thankfully her appointment was thwarted by a grassroots progressive movement, I should say, which vocally objected to her extreme hawkishness and on account of her links to the defense contractors and the defense industry, which is an example of a grassroots progressive movement having an impact. Unfortunately, the appointment of the defense secretary instead went to former US military commander Lloyd George. Lloyd George, unfortunately, also has extensive links with the defense industry as a paid board member of Raytheon, among the world's top 5 defense contractors. As a kind of military man, little is known about his kind of policy preferences. He's kept cards close to his chest. Nonetheless, he is, unfortunately, according to an article in The Diplomat, expected to, quote, broadly follow the template set by his predecessors in the Trump administration. So just to give one example, when George was asked about the Pentagon's 2018 National Defense Strategy, which was released by the Trump administration, and it was the first national defense strategy to officially single out China and Russia, prioritizing the former, I should say, as revisionist powers and central challenges to American security. When George was asked about that, he replied, quote, I think much of the document is absolutely on track for today's challenges. He's also on record as as expressing his support for further American military spending in advanced technologies as a way to counter China, stating in an interview that the US will have to have capabilities that allow us to hold, to present a credible deterrent, to China in the future. That was his Freudian slip, not mine. As I mentioned before, we should expect the Biden administration to effectively continue the Asia pivot initiated by Obama, although with much greater assertiveness and I think much less fanfare. Biden has already quietly reshuffled the National Security Council, downsizing staff in the Middle East Directorate and expanding the Asia Directorate with more senior appointees. In fact, according to a former Obama official, quote, "This is basically a continuation of the pivot to Asia," but without saying so publicly to avoid the blowback that the administration received the first time the pivot was announced. Most of that blowback was about Obama not going hard enough. I think the Sydney Morning Herald's Foreign Affairs and National Security correspondent, Anthony Galloway, is accurate when he wrote recently that Biden's foreign policy will not simply be a continuation of the Obama administration, but rather, quote, "more a hybrid of Trump's assertiveness towards Beijing without the trashing of alliances, multilateralism, and free trade." Although, when it comes to challenging China, I take exception to that last point regarding the trashing of free trade with respect to the Biden administration. The Biden administration's economic agenda with respect to China, as I mentioned earlier, I think is only likely to be different to Trump's on tactics, not substance or policy priorities. And that includes continuing the hypocrisy of the US when it comes to things such as free trade. Biden has in fact clearly stated that his administration is going to, and I quote, this was an interview that he gave recently, to pursue trade policies that actually produce progress on China's abusive practices. That's stealing intellectual property, dumping products, illegal subsidies to corporations, and requiring tech transfers from US to Chinese companies. That's the same policy objectives of the Trump administration. The difference is that Biden is saying here he wants to actually win some concessions. Now, I mean, I should say that a lot of those charges against China are exaggerated or incorrectly framed. Don't have time to go into all of them, but for example, the idea that China's engaged in forced technology transfers is quite ridiculous. They're hardly forced. US corporations have willingly partnered with Chinese corporations in order to gain, market access. China hasn't held a gun to their head. But those targets of China's economic policy, which Biden pointed out, and which were part of the Trump administration's economic agenda for China, effectively amounts to a challenge to China's, what has been an effective Chinese industrial policy. And so what Biden is indicating here is that his administration will continue the Trump administration's attempts to kneecap China's effective development model, particularly with respect to the advanced tech sector, as we saw with the Trump administration execute with China's 5G technology, including pressuring allies like Australia to prevent Chinese companies like Huawei from investing here. So I think there is a real risk that the Biden administration will continue to see China's industrial policy and its burgeoning advanced tech sector as a threat to its economic hegemony and attempt to crush it, although perhaps with, as I mentioned, with different tactics. This is not something that China is likely to take lying down, because it is precisely this very same industrial policy being targeted by the US that China has been able to lift hundreds of millions of its people out of poverty, and is this mode of economic development that China has adopted that provides the only real opportunity, at least in the current global capitalist economic order, for China to break free from US economic subordination and avoid the kind of middle income trap of otherwise successful developing nations where economic growth has stagnated. The Chinese leadership is very worried that its economic growth will stagnate and it will end up like a country like Brazil or Egypt or Thailand or others who have had high growth rates and then fail to be able to break out of the developing world status and into kind of the advanced industrialized world. And so China's industrial model is part of it. It's not just about trade, it's about development. And so, the importance of this continued economic growth in this model is particularly important for the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy and for its authority, of course, in the eyes of the Chinese people. And so China's leaders understandably view this form of economic targeting and pressure from the US as a serious and even an existential threat that risks spilling over into real military confrontation. The argument that's put forth often by US liberals and those within the Democratic Party, even here in Australia, actually quite recently, Kevin Rudd in a piece for Foreign Affairs just this month made the same argument that we should be competing with China we should be engaging in economic or strategic competition, not the kind of more hawkish policy of containment or rivalry. And if we do that, that won't descend into international violence. I think that's quite naive. I think if the US continues on the course of reorienting its economy and its foreign policy into competition with China and adopts competition with China as a kind of national organizing principle, it will be very hard for that dynamic not to descend into some kind of real military conflict in China. So both on the strategic and the economic fronts, I think there are dangers in terms of the Biden administration's policy towards China. Okay, so what does all this mean for Australia, and how might the Australian government respond? Well, in short, probably quite obvious that doesn't bode well for Australia, unfortunately. And I can't see Australia departing significantly from its typical instinct, nurtured and institutionalized over many decades now, of pursuing an ever closer relationship with the United States. Certainly the approach of the Morrison government during the Trump administration doesn't inspire any confidence that Australia will pursue a more independent foreign policy with respect to China in the Biden administration. Despite the extreme and quite unprecedented dangers the Trump administration posed to global peace and security more generally, Australia's integration with the US military continued unabated. The Marine Air Ground Task Force in Darwin reached a level of 2,500 Marines for the first time in 2019, before they had to be scaled back due to COVID-19. Significant expansion of Australia's northern air bases was announced by Morrison last year in order to accommodate US heavy bomber operations. Also last year at the Osmond talks in 2020, there's a secret defence cooperation framework established between the US and Australia to coordinate decisions on joint operations and the deployment of hardware and personnel across the Pacific, with China obviously in mind. Of course, Australia released its 2020 Defence Strategic Update last year, which earmarked the acquisition of longer-range rocket and missile systems, forward-deployed missile defence systems, and research into even longer-range hypersonic missiles, all in alignment with US military doctrine for conflict with China. Australia joined the Malabar military exercises last year with the so-called Quad countries of the US, India, and Japan for the first time since 2007. When Kevin Rudd had, in fact, initially joined that initiative, but later pulled out because it was perceived by China as a form of military containment. So Australia has rejoined. The Trump administration, in fact, resurrected the Quad because it failed after Australia and India were reluctant to join up. The Trump administration resurrected the Quad. Australia has enthusiastically participated in military exercises last year, and there are promises that there will be more military exercises in the future. In fact, Jake Sullivan, that's the new hawkish US National Security Advisor that I mentioned, just announced yesterday that the Biden administration, quote, really wants to carry forward the work with the Quad started under President Donald Trump. At present, the Quad it's not really an alliance yet. It's just a loose network of these four US Indo-Pacific democracies. But Jake Sullivan was reported as stating that it is a goal of the Biden administration to transform the Quad into something more than an informal security relationship. Whether the Biden administration will be successful or not is another question. At the diplomatic level, of course, the Morrison government went to great lengths to curry favor with the Trump administration, despite how universally despised that administration was, even among strong US allies in Europe and Asia. One of the Biden administration's declared priorities is to repair relationships with its allies and partners that were trashed under Trump. But in fact, it needn't do so with Australia because the Morrison government never really stood up to Trump and so never really seriously endured Trump's wrath. Australia's decision to let itself be portrayed as America's attack dog regarding the coronavirus inquiry and suffer a serious deterioration in its relations with China as a result, is a case in point. Despite the economic retaliation by China and the impact this had on Australia's barley, seafood, wine, coal industries, the Morrison government didn't back down, but rather doubled down. And I think there's two kind of lessons to be learned from that experience. Potentially it might give us some insight into how Australia might respond to this kind of thing in the future. The first is that the impact of China's attempted economic coercion on Australia's economy were in fact relatively small, and in fact backfired on China in important ways, which I won't go into the details, but I think that it really illustrates the limits of Chinese economic pressure on Australia. But the second lesson derives from the fact that China's economic coercion didn't, in fact, lead for calls for a significant change in Australian foreign policy. It had the opposite effect. It evoked a kind of a rallying around the flag impact and a kind of a sense of nationalism in response to Chinese bullying. So, I wouldn't be surprised that under pressure from a far less blusterous Biden administration, which is likely to be far more effective at using its soft power, Australia will continue to align itself with the US against China, even should that result in further deterioration in the Australia-China economic relationship. The Biden administration will undoubtedly exercise a significant degree of soft power over Australia. There exists a number of so-called Asia experts seated across the new Biden administration that include officials with long-standing personal relationships with Australia's defence and foreign policy elite. Just to give you one example, Kurt Campbell, who was one of the architects of Obama's pivot to Asia, has been chosen as the coordinator for the Indo-Pacific at the National Security Council of the Biden administration. And Kurt Campbell, over many years, has helped to cultivate a myth about Australia's special relationship with the United States. He was a key mover and shaker of the Australian-American leadership dialogue, a key institution in the exercise of American soft power over Australia, where Australian elites are kind of socialised into the alliance orthodoxy. Another example is Ellie Ratner. He's also considered to be a China hawk, and he's tipped to become the Pentagon's top official overseeing Indo-Pacific affairs. Ratner is one of many former Obama officials who are likely to take on key roles in the Biden administration and who have long-standing institutional links to Australia via think tanks such as the Lowy Institute, the US Studies Centre, the Perth US Asia Centre, ASPI, and so on. The many political and foreign policy elite exchanges and connections fostered by think tanks in Australia and the US will therefore start to kind of pay off as these same experts begin to fill positions in the Biden administration and then use their connections with Australian foreign policy elite to try and carry influence here. Okay, I think I've probably been talking for long enough, so I might just end it there, and more than happy to answer any questions.